I'm here at the International Conference on Men's Issues 2019 with Janice Fiamengo, and she's just delivered a stunning talk about basically looking back at various historical literary references and looking at the fact that gender dynamics in these literary tales and stories were quite complicated and certainly did not fit the feminist narrative of men bad, women good, women always oppressed throughout history. So, yeah, I mean, if you'd like to just go into the tales, talk a little bit about them and what they showed, really.
Okay, well, the first text that I looked at was just a small part of Lord Byron's long comic epic poem, Don Juan. I just looked at a small part from the first canto in which the young hero, Juan, is seduced by an older married woman, in which the final line is, the whole section that I looked at follows her inner struggle against her attraction to this beautiful young man and her sense of her virtue and her propriety as a married woman, but ultimately her attraction to the young man overcomes all these other considerations. But even in the final moment, Byron mocks her conviction of her own virtue by having the narrator describe her saying, I will never consent, but even as she's saying that, she consented. Mm-hmm. And when I had read this poem years and years ago, but then I recently reread it when I was teaching it, and I thought, I mean, how fascinating that he used the word consent, which feminist theorists, of course, have completely taken over, and that he presents the focus of the piece is the discrepancy between what the woman is telling herself and what she believes about herself, her own innocence, and what she's actually doing, which is clearly seducing a sexually innocent boy or a teenager. And it just reminded me of the lie that we tell ourselves in our own era, that women are always sexually powerless, always vulnerable, never the active agents in their own sexual engagements, and that many women actually believe their own propaganda, in a sense, I think, that women, rather than taking responsibility for what they do, often hide behind these feminist narratives of innocent vulnerability and lack of agency. And so it just seemed to me that Byron was aware of that 200 years ago, and it's interesting for us to know that, clearly he must have had some experience of the disjuncture between what the myth of female innocence was in his time and his own experience with women. And so I think it's really useful for us to know that we did not invent our current struggles. Yes, and in fact, even modern feminism didn't create them. That they have existed for centuries and centuries in human experience, and that what the feminists tell us about all of human history being the story of male power and female powerlessness is simply not true. Mm-hmm. It's a bit sobering, I think, in that it makes us aware that the struggles that we're engaged in have been going on for a very long time. The second piece that I looked at was T.S. Eliot's very famous poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is all about his sense of lack of entitlement as a man, mm-hmm. his sense of total inadequacy, his longing for a woman's love and to be able to touch a woman, but his conviction that he will never provoke desire in any woman. Mm-hmm. That, again, has nothing to do with what the feminists tell us about what it was like to be a man in the early 20th century. That's from 1915. And then the last text was Ernest Belfort Bax's The Fraud of Feminism, and Bax...
That's the more well-known one.
Yeah, that's a fairly well-known text,
circle.
By anti-feminists, although I have to admit I did not know about it. I should have probably. I didn't know about it until Lucien Volson. Do you know him? He, the Romanian fellow who does videos. He told me about it. And of course, Paul Elam also had made reference to it on numerous occasions. And so I finally read it from cover to cover quite recently. I mean, I knew that it was a critique of feminism, but I had no idea how totally prescient it is.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that we are dealing with today, that we think of as the consequence of 1970s feminist activism, was already in existence in the late 19th century. Women were treated differently under criminal law. Women had special privileges under the law for marriage, for alimony, for child custody, for sexual assault cases, everything. It was already there. Women could murder their husbands and get away with it by claiming that the husband was abusive. Whenever a man murdered a woman, he could not possibly use that as an excuse. Domestic violence, the man was harshly punished for being violent with his wife, while the woman could do it with impunity. I had no idea that things were already like that in the late 19th century, and Bax wrote extensively about this, and now, all those writings have been lost to all but a few of us who are interested in recovering that history. So the point I was making was really just that very simple point that it helps to know our history, because so much of the feminist, the moral authority that feminists have is in saying that, look, maybe the pendulum in a few cases has swung in women's favor now, but that's justified by the fact that for the last 2,000 years, women have been under men's thumb. And if you actually know anything about history, you know that that isn't true.
And I think those three accounts reveal a far more nuanced version of history than what the feminists make out, which is just that men took all of these jobs and prevented women from working in them. And I mean, if you look at the reality of the situation, it's just completely ludicrous, this idea. And then, I think, again, it reveals the struggles of men, and also the I guess the ways in which a lot of women do behave. Certainly the Byron account with regards to just sexual attraction, and I mean, just that idea of her saying no and then relenting, and I mean, this is a problem that men have encountered throughout time, isn't it? So
exactly. And I was saying in my talk that nowadays, if we'd had that scenario where she says, "I will never consent," but meanwhile she's consenting with everything she's doing in the interaction with this young man, if we heard that in a court of law, suddenly he would be guilty of sexual assault. And that's the whole point Byron is making, is that in matters of male-female sexual desire, yes means yes and no means no is just nonsense. And so to actually send men to prison on the basis of what a woman recollects and claims she said is it's terrifying.
Yes, I think so. And you brought up some other interesting points as well, which was, I think, just kind of looking back at the, a lot of the events that we saw in the 1800s, that certainly that Belford Bax recounts, and just, kind of making men responsible for the actions of their wife, and
the one about infanticide, that there was a move amongst feminists to make a man be held guilty if a woman murdered her illegitimate child. I mean, that drive, it seems to be so deep in at least Western, maybe in all human societies, to hold men accountable for women's actions, even while claiming that women are equal to men in every way, or even superior, but somehow never responsible for doing anything wrong. That it runs so deep, it seems, in our psyches. And his whole point was that women would never have been able to achieve the undoubted gains that they'd made in the feminist movement if not for the active complicity and involvement of many men who rush to get to the front of the line to cheer on a woman while a man is being taken advantage of or having his rights taken away in some way. Unfortunately, men have been complicit in feminism from the beginning, as he argues.
I think that there's just one of the, I guess, the basic interactions between men and women, and this kind of reveals that there is this the issue of hypergamy, and the fact that women will use that for their own gain, and men also will fall into this trap of doing what the woman wants and actually ignoring, I guess, any trace of societal fairness, and doing away with that. And I think that's a drama that's been playing out the whole time.
And that's the thing. We often think, well, early feminism, it was legitimate. It was a sane, rational movement that had laudable aims, and we can applaud that movement. And it was only in much later days it went wrong. But Bax's point was it was wrong from the beginning. It was never about equality. It was always about female supremacy. It was always about, as he said, using the power of the state in order to enforce female power at the expense of men. And I think it helps to know that has been the case for many, many decades, longer than we often think now.
Well, one of the interesting, I don't have a specific source on this, but one of the interesting points I've seen is that with the institution of the church, there was always a focus on having, the father or the priest as the head of the local church for every specific, parish, for every community. And, this was the case in the UK and right across Europe. And that was the case for hundreds of years. And I think there was part of it was that, by the clergy, there was this belief that it needed to be a man who was in charge of the local community, because there was a worry that if it was a woman, then she would work in the interests of the sisterhood rather than the interests of society.
That's interesting.
Have you sort of seen much information about this? Or
I don't know a great deal about the history of the church. I know that by the mid-19th century there were many challenges, at least on the Protestant side of things, to male leadership in the church, and we've seen that increase over the last 150 years. But it makes sense if men recognized that could be a problem. I know there is biblical warrant, like St. Paul talks about the necessity for male leadership, although there were female evangelists even in Paul's day that he commends in his letters. So, it makes sense that godly people would have been concerned that that authority be exercised rightly, which never meant entirely excluding women from positions of power in the church, but meant that the head, the head should be male. And I don't know a great deal about that, but I wouldn't be surprised that they recognized the danger.
I think one of the things we don't recognise so much, today in 2019, with like a society where we have electricity and all of the other amenities of modern day life, that life itself was pretty stark back then, and that they actually needed a strong local community. And so there really was a focus on ensuring that the local community was strong, and so it could withstand problems like failed harvests and that sort of thing. So
it only stood to reason that if you wanted your community to survive, you had to have at least a large number of women who are having a lot of children, and that meant that those women's energies were going into
involved in that as well.
Up until age 10, children have to be very carefully watched and nurtured, and their health looked after, and women were, all of their energies were taken up doing that. There were always roles for single women in the church and elsewhere, as teachers, as healers, so it was never the case, at least not in the history of the West, that women were absolutely excluded from positions of power and authority.
No, not at all.
It was just the case that in the family it made the most sense for women to be primarily involved in childbearing and child rearing.
The other kind of mythological theme that I see emerging from the past is the character of the witch as well. And I'm
Yeah.
not sure if you looked much into that particular archetype. I mean, you didn't mention it in your talk, but I'm not sure if you looked into that otherwise, because I find it's a really interesting archetype, and it seems that well, on the one hand, there's the idea of the innocent woman who is portrayed as being a witch by the evil, villainous man, and so she is then tortured and ultimately
Yes.
killed by the village, and
patriarchy,
yeah. But then there's the other idea as well, which is that it's a woman who uses her ability to manipulate things to cause absolute havoc within the local community by the way she uses the magic and stuff. That's representative of the manipulation she engages in, and so there's the facade of being nice, but then underneath that there's the monster. And I was just wanting to get your interpretation on the character of the witch.
Well, I was very influenced as a younger woman by a documentary, or it claimed to be a documentary called The Burning Times. Have you ever heard of it?
The Burning Times.
It came out in, I think, about 1989 or 1990, and it was it was a radical feminist rewriting of history to claim that there were all of these wise women in communities in Europe throughout from about the 15th century, I guess, through the 17th century. And they were the women who had the knowledge of the community, who kept the knowledge of the community. And this film claimed that when men decided that they wanted to have charge of all of medicine and healing, they had to get rid of these women, and that the witchcraft craze was the assertion by the patriarchy of male power over these powerful women. And it was very upsetting, very disturbing film, the sort of thing that you come away. I mean, it was very well done too, very emotionally, riveting, and it's the sort of thing that turns you into a feminist and portrays all of history as the history of beautiful, life-giving, affirming women being treated horribly by malicious, mean-spirited men, power-hungry men. And in fact, I'm not an expert in the history of witch burnings and the witch hunting of the European Middle Ages and later, but men as well as women were targeted as witches. And in fact, the numbers who were killed were quite small, really. And and it wasn't gendered in the way that feminists have told us it was. It was a lot. I'm not an expert, but from those people I've talked to who are historians and experts in that field, it was again a much more complicated, nuanced sort of picture of superstition, I suppose, to some extent, and power struggles than feminists have told us. So yeah, it is interesting to speculate about what kind of women might have been perceived to be witches, and whether what they were getting up to that might have caused communities to mistrust them.
Sure, I think it's just one manifestation of the devouring mother, and
Yes.
because I see a lot of manifestations of that particular image within mythology, and I think one of them is the witch, and it's a woman who serves herself and basically presents the outward display of beauty, but then underneath there's the horrible inner core.
Right.
And she also uses her tricks to basically to help herself and to cause other people harm as well.
Right. Yeah.
And so I do think that this is an important character archetype and instance of female villainy, probably a universal one.
We've denied that so extensively, and it's such an obvious point, but one that keeps needing to be made, that we've never been under any doubt when we look at our current society or the past that men can be both good and bad. And there's a shadow side to maleness. It has to do with violence. It has to do with aggression. It has to do with hunger for a certain kind of power. And we recognize, at least we do in sane times, that men can be wonderful leaders, but they can also be antagonists who cause harm.
Yes, yeah.
But and that's just obvious. But we don't recognize it about women. So anytime
It seems we used to, but
yeah,
then
we exactly.
Yeah.
We used to, but for a long time, maybe starting with chivalry and then intensifying throughout the gynocentrism of the Christian West, we just came to see women more and more as saintly. Mm-hmm. And so we kept denying that there could be any dark side to women, and that the feminine could ever manifest as anything other than life-giving, nurturing, light-bringing, etc. And it's and to try to say that a woman could have evil intentions or could want power for herself and use it to destructive ends, you're met with a cry of disbelief and anger. Women can only be either pure and innocent, or if they've done something wrong, it's because they were victimized. It's never because of any other reason.
And I think it actually denies so much good drama when you get rid of these villains and you say that the female character has to be saintly and lovely and so on. And
it makes our storytelling pretty boring.
And
our insight into that half of humanity extremely thin and impoverished. And anybody who's ever known women knows that women have some wonderful qualities and women have bad qualities too. And I mean, it is so strange that the feminist motto is feminism is the radical notion that women are human, but that everything about feminism is denying female humanity, essentially, because if you deny the capacity for evil, if you deny agency to do wrong things as well as good things, then you are denying women's humanity.
Exactly.
It's crazy.
And I'm reminded of certainly the characters Ursula in The Little Mermaid and the witch in Hansel and Gretel, and just the you've got the example of villainy there, but then obviously there's also the angelic female character that you see in a lot of fairy tales as well, and or the heroine, and they're the positive characters as well as the negative ones, and it just seems to me that that's what actually makes drama good, is when you have these juxtapositions of the positive characters
because
against
they seem true. And they remind us of something, or they inform us about something that we recognize as fundamentally real in our own lives, even if taking very different forms. And it's just bizarre that feminism has flipped everything. They see the good characters in all of these fairy tales or myths or ancient stories. They see those as patriarchal projections that are designed to suppress women, and they absolutely deny, or they either try to say that the portrayal of evil female characters is just a male misrepresentation of female power. So everything gets sort of turned inside out, and it's always a patriarchal misrepresentation of one kind or another. What feminists themselves have to say about about female evil, it could be fit into a very small essay, because it's just something that feminists
that doesn't exist or something.
They absolutely do not want to encounter it. It's amazing. I mean, you have women.
And I think you then end up creating, I'm not sure if you saw it, but the latest Star Wars film, The Last Jedi. And
it was just awful.
There was, I guess the idea there was that, you shouldn't have a male character who tries to do well, who actually endeavours to improve themselves, and instead what you need is a pink-haired social justice smug woman who walks into frame and instantly knows exactly what to do and doesn't have to engage in any self-improvement whatsoever, but just has that insight to know what to do, and is basically perfect.
Women leaders are going to solve all our problems, and women heroes are always going to use their power for good, and yeah, it's deathly boring. I don't think it rings true to our experience of the complexity of being male and female, and yeah, it's just, I don't know, it's going to kill Hollywood. And,
Yes, yeah.
yeah, I would think anyway, because I'm not very interested in watching those creations.
Okay, and yeah, just finally, one of the other chaps brought up this point before. I think it was after your talk, and it was just the work that William Collins had done about the so it was the Universal Suffrage Act in the UK, and it's called Centuries of Oppression, and so there's a
Which I
video
haven't
series.
seen, but I intend to watch.
And also he did a written piece as well, and it just looks at the actual reality of what all of the circumstances that led to that act being enforced, and then since then the radical feminist take on what happened during that period. And one of the horrific things they did, I thought, was they released a film a few years ago, Suffragette, and this film had like every single negative male stereotype in it. The sort of the domestic abuser, the drunk, basically all of these men trying to being violent to all of these women, and the women working on their own and then getting the vote and doing it through violence. And then there was kind of the promotion of violence in the film as a way of bringing about political change. And I mean, it's just crazy that they're promoting this narrative and also this organisation of the suffragettes as well, despite the fact that it was, they accomplished almost nothing, and it was if you look at the actual what led to that act being passed in the UK, it was mainly like nearly 1 million men dying during World War One, and also it was the suffragists as well, and that was women and also men, and it was a universal suffrage movement. But that's all being ignored, and instead they're promoting the suffragettes, I guess, because that fits more in line with the radical feminist ideas they're trying to promote now.
They've glorified the suffragettes for a long time. Certainly when I was studying feminist history, and this is in like the early 1990s, the suffragettes were always the focus, because there's this great romanticization of their supposed suffering, although E. Belfort Bax talks about that too. Apparently they were treated very leniently in general. Property destruction and arson and all sorts of quite serious crimes that they committed, that if it had been committed by a man, even whatever political cause, he would have been very harshly punished. There was a whole wing of a particular prison, Bax references, where they were quite nicely treated and had a relatively easy time of it. But the idea that they suffered heroically, for this noble cause, and that nobody else cared about it, is a very romantic one that has attracted feminist historians for a long time. So, I mean, in Canada, there was never the radical suffragette movement. Most Canadian women weren't very interested in getting the vote at all, and it was attained with relative ease. There were very few activists who were involved in the campaign over a number of years, and many, many men who supported them in their interest in the vote. And so it's not a very heroic history at all. But the glorification of violence. I don't know what they're thinking, because if they really think violence is wonderful, they must know that if women are on the end of, if men ever become violent in their opposition to women's demands, it's not going to be a good story for women. But I think they're so confident that they need not fear that. And they know that the tendency, as we said at the beginning of this, the tendency for men is to fight other men in order to protect even, completely irrational, law-breaking, violent women. They are protected by the very fact of their sex. It leads to a lot of very bad behavior on women's part.
I think so. I think that's a good point to end on. So thank you for talking to me today. And so you're going to watch a few talks now at the conference?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to watching the rest of the talks.
Excellent.
It's been great so far.
Okay, well, good stuff. Thanks a lot.